Leaders of the group of 7 countries will meet this Friday in the English town of Cornwall to begin the 3-day summit that many contend to be the last real chance for the West to come together and show solidarity in the face of global challenges. Items high on the agenda include ending the COVID-19 pandemic and ways in which the world will go forward in green recovery and growth, while strengthening their value-based cooperation in new technologies. Leaders of South Korea, Australia, India and South Africa will be joining the meeting. So can the world's major democracies come together and cooperate on global recovery? That is the question that we're posing today to Dr. Kim Byung-ju, Professor at Korea University of Foreign Studies, and Dr. Gregory Schaffer, Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science and Director of the Center on Globalization Law and Society at the University of California, Irvine. Thank you both so much for joining us. And well, to dive straight into the questions, starting with you, Professor Kim, the G7 summit, it's been criticized in recent years for losing its effectiveness. And well, the pandemic has only proven that Western countries are struggling to unite in the face of challenges. So what do you think they will have to do at this meeting to prove that they are back and that they are standing in unity?
I think they are determined to address some of the most pressing questions that the global community faces at this moment, which definitely, obviously, and not surprisingly include a question of COVID-19. And then also green growth, perhaps, in dealing with climate change cooperation and the climate change crisis and so on. And at the same time, they'll be also addressing some of the questions about the global supply chain, which showed serious disruption as a result of COVID-19. And also, we have seen some fluctuations and uncertainties rising from the recent years' confrontation between Beijing and Washington as well. So most of the most pressing issues will be dealt with in Cornwall for sure. And in terms of relevance of G7, in its history, if we look back, it's very long. We know it was originated from the early and mid-1970s, and that was the time when the world community faced external shocks like oil shock and hyperinflation and global slowdown altogether, kind of like overall slowdown of the post-war world economy. And at that time, of course, it was perfect sense. It made perfect sense to have world's leading 7 nations, United States, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan getting together to talk about global issues. But since then, 4 or 5 decades have passed so far. And we remember back in 2008, when financial crisis happened, actually, U.S. government put together not G7, but G20 countries, group of G20 countries to talk about ways to overcome the global crisis and so on. So there have been many different ideas suggested for improving G7. And so this is age-old discussion we're having on the table about the relevance of G7. And definitely we'll see whether the relevance will be strengthened or not as a result of Cornwall discussion this time for sure.
Well, it looks like they have quite a lot of issues to juggle with there. And Professor Schaffer, in your view, what kind of outcome would make this G7 summit meaningful?
Well, first, given the history that I just put forth on the G7, both in terms of the rise of the G20 and the relative decline of major economies, the G7's dominance of global policy making, and then the Trump administration, which belittled the G7 and the president could be antagonistic and outright express antipathy towards other G7 leaders. So there's huge relief that President Biden wishes to work closely with Democratic allies and is committed to building better foreign relations with them. Recall that under President Trump, they couldn't even issue a communique at the end of the G7 meeting. And so from a minimal perspective, at least there's going to be a joint communique, and that's going to have symbolic value regarding the United States' return to the international stage as a committed ally to G7 democracies. That in itself will be significant. It will provide a vision for cooperation among like-minded, market-oriented democracies going forward. Nonetheless, what it can achieve is limited. The banner is building back better. They will address 4 main issues, which can be viewed as, in a sense, the 4 Cs. One is the climate crisis. The second is COVID-19. And the third is collaborating in response to cyber attacks by Russia, including interference with democratic processes. And then finally, China and concerns regarding China's economic model. And the communique will address, I'm sure, all four of these issues in terms of a path and commitments to moving forward.
And perhaps President Joe Biden is hoping for a political boost before he embarks upon his summits with leaders in the EU and the Russian president, of course, following the G7 meeting. And, well, Professor Schaffer, the idea of inviting the guest participants this year actually came about last year when former President Donald Trump asked these countries to attend. It seems that the US does want all Quad countries, as well as South Korea, to join this G7 club this year at least. What do you think the G7 members are really hoping to see from these so-called middle power countries, particularly South Korea?
Yes, so this builds out from what President Trump had proposed. Of course, recall is a little bit more complicated because President Trump also included Russia initially, which the other G7 members refused. So we're focusing on sort of the Quad and Korea. And what does this reflect? Well, it reflects developing an alliance with liberal democracies, especially Korea and the Quad in Asia, given U.S. great power competition with China and growing perceptions of Chinese aggression in terms of trade in the South China Sea and so forth. So as regards China, the U.S. is trying to build consensus and a common position to pressure China to reduce the role of state subsidies that can lead to global surpluses and overcapacity affecting workers and businesses around the world, and to address concerns over Chinese practices forcing technology transfers as a condition for accessing the Chinese market. And so it'll be key to move beyond the G7 and bring in these other democracies in Asia to build a common front.
And Professor Kim, what does this G7 meeting really mean for South Korea, which is going to be joining the group for their meetings? What do you think the country can contribute?
On several fronts, we can see potential contribution coming from Seoul, South Korea here. For example, the vaccine hub idea that President Moon Jae-in and Joe Biden agreed in Washington in their recent summit, where United States will provide technology and R&D capacity, and and Korea will also work on R&D, but also production of the vaccine in coming years and months. As we know, we are keenly aware that the COVID-19 crisis is not going to be permanently ending after the recent challenges. So on that front, Korea's role is pretty much expected, and probably President Moon Jae-in will make it clear what kind of roles can be played. And also other issue areas just like high tech and climate change, South Korea's role will be very important, and President Moon Jae-in will take this opportunity to kind of articulate what kind of contributions South Korea can make. Indeed, a few days ago, as we know, White House issued a special report on global supply chain and high-tech products and so on. And South Korea's role there was very much highlighted. And so we could naturally expect some kind of a response or reaction from President Moon in UK at this time at the summit about how South Korea is going to deal with this overall, the issue of changing or reorganizing global supply chain. Climate change cooperation is important, and recently Korea hosted a very important P4G summit in terms of one of the vehicles to work towards climate change. And I think President Moon probably will add further points in terms of Korea's commitment for how this country is going to contribute to the climate change as well. So there is a wide range of issues, long list of topics that this country, as an observer country for G7, will add to their discussions this time.
Right, the talks are obviously expected to be quite abundant with the number of issues that they have to handle. And Professor Schaffer, obviously the focus will be on COVID-19 vaccines at the moment, and there's been quite a lot of debate over vaccine patents. Now, the US and the EU, they've been quite divided over finding a practical way forward in terms of getting the whole world vaccinated, especially in countries that are experiencing severely high infection and fatality rates. Do you think they will be able to find some kind of middle ground on how to supply and distribute vaccines?
Yes. Well, I think formally the positions are quite different, and I don't think they'll find a middle ground with respect to a waiver of patent rights under the TRIPS agreement. But they do have common commitments to ensure that vaccine access and production for developing countries around the world is radically increased. So the main obstacle is to license the technology in order the trade secrets that lie behind producing these vaccines. And as I wrote in an op-ed recently, that it's the threat of a waiver which will, in the question that is hopefully will be sufficient to shift the incentives of patent holding companies to enter contracts with manufacturers subject to non-disclosure agreements, that we can have a massive increase in the scale of production for developing countries. And I'm sure that the United States and other GC members will make commitments to enhance access around the world. And that will be the form that a common understanding will take at this meeting.
And Professor Kim, you did mention supply chains, rebuilding supply chains around the world. And well, how do you think the G7 countries are going to rebuild their trade links and supply chains, particularly on highly sensitive technologies? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the possible conception of the so-called D10 club of democratic partners, which would include the G7 countries as well as South Korea, Australia and India. There's also been the idea of T12 mentioned, a League of Techno-Democracies. Should we expect to see these countries turn into a D10 or T12 at this meeting?
I think we will get to see some of the kind of mixed form of both ideas of D10 and T12 emerging soon, if it is not emerging yet. I think we are already seeing the formation of it in a way, in many ways, in dealing with this kind of sensitive technology issues. And particularly, as I mentioned, the White House report that came out 2 days ago about rebuilding the global supply chain and what kind of ideas United States has in doing so attracts a lot of attention. And we'll have to wait and see how all these things pan out. The thing is, this is not purely government action-based plan. Rather, reshuffling of global supply chain means actually the governments need great cooperation, very high level of cooperation from the corporate sector as well. So what it means is whatever the changes that are coming in our way, it will have to serve the interest of the corporations. So corporations will have to agree on some of the action points that what they are supposed to do actually will serve and enhance their interest. So that involves a lot of complicated process and procedures, as we can naturally expect. This is not only White House moving on its own, but also the ally governments will have to come along. In addition, the bigger challenge will be all these corporations, not only U.S. corporations, but corporations of these key ally countries will have to come along. Just like several of Korea's leading corporations showed their gesture of cooperation at the time of recent summit between Korea and U.S. in Washington recently. Those kind of actions will have to follow through, and it will take time. It will take a lot of efforts for coordination to create this kind of cooperation scheme, if you will.
Well, Professor Schaffer, now China is also expected to be discussed quite extensively at this meeting, and there's anticipation that the G7 countries may collaborate to challenge China's Belt Road Initiative with an infrastructure plan of their own. What do you think this would look like?
Okay. Well, in response to the Belt and Road Initiative, the United States created a new international development finance corporation, which under the BUILD Act, which focuses on stimulating loans, guarantees, investment funds, and risk insurance for investment by the private sector in developing countries. The European Union is gearing up as well, as is India. The hope is that they can coordinate some of their efforts as they also work independently to provide an alternative. For example, one of the key issues will be the availability of 5G technology, which currently China dominates to the chagrin of the United States and others. And so they will want to see if they can coordinate to provide an alternative for these basic forms of infrastructure for the digital economy of the future. Whether they'll expend the resources that China has committed under the Belt and Road Initiative is unlikely, But most importantly, this will be good for poor countries. They're going to have more options for better finance or development.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what kind of outcomes will come out of this G7 meeting over the weekend. But for now, this is where we'll have to end the interview. That was Dr. Kim Byung-ju, professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies based here in Seoul, and Dr. Gregory Schaffer, professor at the University of California, Irvine. Thank you both so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.